ठीक
आज तो इतने वैलिडिटी ऑडिटोरियम इसीलिए ऑडिटोरियम क्लीन करके रखेंगे ना एक बार वो हो जाए
देखें हमको
बनाए
We looked earlier. Yeah, can you call it up? We checked it this morning. I don't know where it is. I don't know where it is.
yes.
No, where is my presentation?
Yes. Open the front page.
Blank कर दूंगा उसको.
Yeah. There we go.
ठीक है, keep it there. So this one, you can change the slides.
Left, right. This is left and right. Oh, yes. Stage.
Good morning, all.
Yeah.
Good morning, all. Respected speaker, Professor James Markusen, Chair of the session, Professor Manoj Pan, the acting director of IFT, Professor Bhatia, the senior professors, students, and participants. So today we'll have the special lecture. The topic is Theory and Empirics of Multinational Firms. Where are we? Where should we go? So before that, I will first introduce the chair, Professor Manoj Pant. Then I will introduce the speaker, Professor James Markusen. Professor Pant, he is an eminent trade theorist of India. He works on international trade. He has a teaching experience for the last 40 years. He was until recently was the vice chancellor of IFT. Before that, he was a professor at JNU, visiting faculty at IIM Lucknow. He did his PhD from Southern Methodist University, USA. He has worked as consultant, senior fellow, and principal investigator for various research projects sponsored by organizations such as FICCI, Ford Foundation, EIITF, NIPFP, United States Agency for International Development, International Development Research Council for India, and various other agencies. And he has conducted very large projects for when he was in IFT, like for PayPal. And so thank you, sir, for coming to chair the session. So now I will introduce our today's speaker, Professor James Markusen, from the distinguished professor from the University of Colorado, Boulder, United States. Professor Markusen is currently, after his retirement, the University Distinguished Professor at University of Colorado, Boulder, and he was also the chairman of the Economics Department from 1991 to 1995. So he was raised in Minneapolis, USA, and he did his education from Boston College, both his BA and PhD. And his advisors were James Anderson and John Willett. So he has a vast professional experience, like he was the professor of economics in University of Western Ontario, professor at University College Dublin, and visiting lecturer at the University of Ghana, New South Wales, University of California, San Diego, the Hebrew University, Israel, the University of Melbourne, Pompeu Fabra in Spain, Hito Subasi University in Japan, University of New South Wales in Australia, and Shandong University. So he has been the member of Research Advisory Group, Royal Commission on the Economic Union and Development Prospects for Canada. He has been also the research associate for NBER, and he has won many awards and honors. He has been the Social Sciences Research Professor for University of Western Ontario, Boulder Faculty Assembly Research Excellence Award in 1997, Jagdish Bhagwati Award for Best Article in the Journal of International Economics, Stanford Calder Teaching Excellence Award, and many other things. So he has also been awarded the Honorary Doctor of Philosophy from Tübingen University, I think it's in Netherlands. And his field of research is in international trade and investment, microeconomic theory, numerical general equilibrium modeling, and regional economics. He has published in many reputed journals like the American Economic Review, the Review of Economic Studies, Journal of International Economics, and he has published like many papers in international trade in all the top journals. And his principal interests are in the field of international trade and FDI. And his research over 40 years has concentrated on the location, production, and welfare effects of large-scale firms and multinational corporations, on which today's talk is based. So, sir, I request you to, so I hand over the session to the session chair, Professor Philip.
Thank you, John. Now, if you're a trade theorist, what is the trade theory? Which try and put some of his work in perspective. The whole development of trade theory have followed empirical changes, right? Typically, sometimes theory comes before empirics, sometimes empirics comes before theory. And we all of you students should know that we began with the Ricardian theorem, which talked about commodities allowing exchange of productivity between countries. And then we came to the Hexagon theorem, which said that trade in commodities allows exchange of factor of production between countries, substitute of factor of production. And we then had a long lull, Ricardo theory, 18th century, 17th century, that we don't have anything to the actual theorem of 20th century. And then we had the discovery by Grubel-Lloyd, later formalized by Krugman, about intra-industry trade. How in reality trade seems to be between similar countries, which is not something which the Ricardian theorem, etc., could explain. Now, in developing trade theory, therefore, you have two issues. One, what can cause trade is change in prices between countries or difference in prices between countries before trade. Whether it's the Ricardian theorem or whether it's the Hexagon theorem, the difference in prices is what leads to the benefits of trade. Krugman changed it and said, no, price and a second aspect, varieties. People can exchange varieties as long as people like varieties, there's always gains in trade. And a paper which I often teach, well, I used to teach my students in advanced trade theory in JNU, which I never got time to offer the option here. Professor Markusen in his, but to me, very, very underquoted paper, 1986 AER, at the third dimension. And he said that the whole of edifice of trade theory is based on a very questionable assumption called homothetic demand. The reality in the world is that demand cannot be homothetic. And the most important example, except for the work that he quoted, is the fact that either you have demand is homothetic or you have Engel's law. Both cannot coexist. It doesn't make sense. So if you don't, suppose you drop homothetic demand, can that be a possible reason for a type of trade which we observed? The type of trade he was trying to explain was, why is it that although the Hexagon and the Ricardian theorems can explain trade between different countries, dissimilar countries, and Krugman's model can explain trade between similar countries, what explains the fact that trade between, let's say, North and North, as compared to trade between North and South has been changing? What is leading to the change of the ratio? In fact, many of you may be aware, actually trade between South and South has been increasing since about 1995 and dominates actually the other kind of trade. So what leads to this change, and what he did try to show was that the if you allow for the dropping the assumption of non-homothetic demand, then we have a third factor which can drive trade, which is difference in demand between countries. So difference in the tastes or different in the demand functions which are non-homothetic demand functions between countries, which is really the reality in world trade, explains that. So I believe it was a very important step in the development in trade theory. Subsequently, he has trained his attention to another very, very crucial empirical factor, that the whole of trade theory it looks at trade as if it's trade between countries. But as businessmen know, and we should know, it is not countries which trade, but firms which trade. And actually the dominant form of trade, about 70%, is what is now known as intra-firm trade. That is trade between units of the same corporation. So how can we not have a theory, again based on empirical observations, which excludes a discussion of trade between similar firms? It is not two different countries, but units of the same firm, where, as everyone in the theory of transnational corporation knows, the accounting means the actually, except for taxation differences, there is no reason why there should be any value to a price they charge between firms. If not for taxation, any arbitrary price would work fine, as long as the maximization of profits is global. So he worked on that, and he has a lot of, which he will tell us about. He developed this theory of transnational corporation, that you have to actually transnational corporations divert away, or they relax, they sort of break the assumption of all trade theories of perfect competition, whether it's Krugman, which is imperfect competition, or actual Ricardo, they bank on the assumption of perfect competition. But perfect competition cannot explain why countries trade technologies through TNCs, right? We all know that. So he has developed this whole theory of TNCs over the last, what, say, about 15, 20 years, where he's been working on how do we have a theory of TNCs? How do you explain why firms exist in two countries? Why shouldn't they simply export? Or why shouldn't they be independent firms? Why should you go through the headache of setting up a new firm in a different country and running? And that's what we now teach today as a theory of TNCs. So with that introduction and noting that I personally believe as a trade theorist that Professor Markusen has made very, very similar contributions to interplay between empirics and theoretical developments. I pass it on to you, James. All yours.
Great, thank you. I turn on the. Okay. Okay, good morning, if it's still morning, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. It's my first trip to India, and as a trade economist, I always felt that there was, a deficiency in my record for not having visited India. So I've been having a wonderful time and enjoying it very much. I sprained a tendon 2 days before leaving Boulder, cycling in the mountains, which is what we do. And I said, I don't care what's wrong, I'm getting on that plane. Okay. So I'm hobbling a little, but otherwise in good shape. Okay, so you can see the title of what I'm going to talk about today, and a little bit of it, some review, and then, but I want to move through that. A lot of you have know some of this stuff quite well, and get on to what I think are some of the deficiencies and the direction we want to go. I know a lot of you are graduate students, and so maybe throw out some ideas, and I want to make sure I get there. So I'll watch the time. I don't know. We're starting a little late, but I don't know what the constraints are. Okay. So I want to start with exploring some of the concepts and empirical findings about what do multinationals do. A short title of the talk would be, what do multinationals do? And among alternative views, which are the most consistent with the empirical evidence, and what is missing from both our theory and our empirical understanding of multinationals, and then go on to suggestions for future research. So when I was a young man, when Manoj and I were young, multinational corporations were basically viewed as part of international macro, just part of the theory of capital flows, which looks at multinationals from the input side, essentially, how much is invested, where every year the UNCTAD would publish its World Investment Report, which is a big, thick 2.54 centimeter book, which is 1 inch in old English units. And it was entirely on the capital investment side of what multinational, and you could go through that and not really understand what in fact multinationals were doing, right? So in the last couple of decades, some of us coming from the trade theory side and a much more micro approach to things, wanted to look at multinationals as real production units, look at the output side. So what is the geographic pattern of multinational location and production? What are the activities performed by affiliates as opposed to parents? what is the inter-firm trade, the interaction between the affiliates and parents in flows of goods, services, and especially intangibles. And I want to spend some time on that. So in simple terms, we wanted to change the focus of multinational analysis from the input side, from the investment side to the output side, production side of the model. And this switch allows us to actually address a lot of the things that come up as policy controversies over multinationals, whereas the traditional macro approach from the investment side didn't really speak to these issues at all. Okay, so this is kind of get some terminology down and remind a lot of you that of how this works. We all often start when I teach this to students about the distinction between location and ownership decisions, and sometimes these get a little bit confused. So the location decision we often call offshoring, which is a bit of an awkward term. And this is about firms' choices to how they're going to serve foreign markets. Are they going to produce abroad to serve those markets? Are you going to export to those markets? Are you going to produce abroad mainly for cost reasons to ship things back home? Those are the elements of the choices you have in offshoring decisions. And then ownership, which we call outsourcing or vertical integration, is an ownership decision. If you do decide to produce abroad, do you do it through an owned foreign affiliate, or do you form a relationship with a domestic firm in the host country via contracts or licenses or some vehicle to exploit your products and services? Sometimes the business press or politicians will refer to both of these things as outsourcing, and they're really quite different. So we like to keep that terminology separate. This talk, I'm going to focus mostly on the location decision just because of time constraints. So we're largely going to restrict ourselves to owned foreign affiliates, and most of the data I show you will, in fact, be majority owned foreign affiliates. There's a whole bunch of things I won't review, such as heterogeneous firms and global value chains and so forth, but I'll indicate a few things about those. All right, so sort of a next step is to think about some archetypes or maybe pure cases is a better term in terms of these location decisions. One type of firm that we think about is we call them horizontal firms, and the key concept for horizontal firms is replication. So these are firms where the affiliates do much of the same thing that the home firm does, the parent, in terms of producing similar or same goods and services serving the foreign market. And these kind of firms might displace trade. They might substitute for trade in intermediate and final goods, but they create a different kind of trade. And this I will talk about late in my talk, which is trade in the services of intangible assets between parents and affiliates. And we'll explore in a minute what kind of technologies and factors encourage horizontal multinationals. The second kind of pure type are vertical firms. And I think a lot of times this is, that business journalists and politicians and even many economists think this must be the common type of multinational firms. The key concept here is fragmentation rather than replication. So you geographically fragment production process by stages. This can create trade. This can be a complement to trade in final and intermediate goods. And it's encouraged by low trade costs, whereas horizontal firms can be encouraged by high trade costs, high transactions costs. And then there's other types. One we call export platform, which is common in the data. And this is foreign affiliates that serve third country markets. So the home firm is in one country, the affiliates in another country, but a lot of the affiliate production is supplied to third countries. And that's referred to as export platform. And for a while it seemed mysterious. We looked at the data, and I don't think it's turns out to be very mysterious when you see the numbers. Okay, so there's kind of a natural association of horizontal firms with local and regional sales. It shows up in their sales pattern, and sometimes we refer to horizontal firms as being market-driven motive, as having market-driven motives, and there can be very little intra-firm trade, intra-firm trade with the home headquarters and so forth. So there's very few pure cases of any of these type of firms, but it's a useful organizing concept. So examples of fairly pure types of horizontal firms are often found in services. And these could be things like anything from fast food chains to hotels, accounting, engineering, legal, marketing, management, consulting, businesses and stuff. They're doing abroad the same things they're doing at home. Okay. And so those are some relatively pure examples. And there's kind of a natural association of vertical firms with high levels of export sales, intra-firm trade, and what we call cost-driven motives. So in a couple of sessions yesterday that we had terms like, searching for low labor costs and so forth. And so this is associated with these vertical firms. So in manufacturing, being part of a global value chain where affiliates are doing parts of the production process based on local characteristics such as wages for different skill levels of labor, which the firm is essentially arbitraging locations where each phase of production is cheap. So for example, affiliates import components, they do low skilled assembly work, and they ship the output back to the parent company. If you ask what we call the man on the street in the United States, they would say that's what multinationals do. Okay. These export platform production multinationals don't turn out to be very mysterious at all. They're just, if you have plant level scale economies, you put one plant in an integrated region and you serve it all. Almost all of the export platform production of US multinationals is in Europe, where you're putting one factory in one country, but you're serving the whole EU. Okay. Ireland is an example of this, where there's a lot of US multinationals that have software, hardware, and pharmaceutical plants, and they have one plant that serves the whole EU, country of 5 million people. Okay, so moving to sort of how we built up theory for incorporating multinationals as part of general equilibrium models, focusing on the output production side rather than investment side. The theoretical models have a number of key ingredients that are needed to support these different kinds of firms in general equilibrium. This is theory now. The first one I call non-rivaled intangible assets, or knowledge-based assets. And non-rivaled, you know the terminology from public goods. It means that the asset yields the full value in multiple locations. You can add locations without reducing its value in any given location. So we always used to use the example of a blueprint. I don't know if they're blue anymore, and they're probably on a screen instead of on a blueprint. But the idea is once you make this investment in creating a product or a process, that's a fixed cost at the firm level, and you can just use that blueprint all over the world without any additional cost. So that's what we mean by non-rival. And these yield firm level as opposed to plant level scale economies that are a key ingredient for getting the existence of horizontal firms in general equilibrium. Now, the thing about knowledge-based assets is if they're non-rival, maybe they're also non-excludable. Meaning you can't put a fence around them and prevent other people from using them. So a second assumption, which will weaken in a minute, is that these assets are non-rivaled, but they are excludable. That they can be held as proprietary assets within the ownership boundaries of the firm. Otherwise, they could be instantly copied and used by other parties, and they would really hold no value when you export them to a foreign affiliate. A third assumption is often made implicitly. People don't realize it, but I'll call it geographic separability, which means that there's fairly low cost in separating, say, a production plant from headquarters. If they're intimately bound together, that's gonna prevent you from utilizing these assets abroad, even if they are non-rival. And the final assumption that is important for getting the existence of vertical firms as a solution in the general equilibrium model is, I'll call, skilled labor intensity. And that is that headquarters, for example, headquarters are skilled labor intensive relative to production. And that gives you this arbitrage motive, which is crucial in getting the existence of vertical firms as an equilibrium. Some of these assumptions get weakened when we talk about outsourcing versus vertical integration. There's a literature, and I've contributed to this, where the intangible assets are at least partially non-excludable. And that may even be if they're used within the ownership boundary of the firm. So for example, managers and other employees of foreign affiliates learn the technology, learn the management practices, and they can leave the firm and work for rival firms or start their own firms or complementary firms. Often people leave multinational firms and end up as suppliers, producing components or services for their former employer. So it's not necessarily an adversarial relationship. And also there's a long literature on incomplete and unenforceable contracts, and I probably won't have any time for that today. Okay, so let's just give you a little more idea about the structure of these models without going into any, trying to avoid much technical detail in the time we have. You can build these up from actually fairly simple, straightforward technologies, but then it gets complicated in general equilibrium where you have endogenous factor prices across countries. So here's just a quick example on this slide. Think of F as a firm level fixed cost. So it creates firm level scale economies, and it's skilled labor intensive. G is a plant level fixed cost. So that has to be incurred for each plant in each country. And T is a transport cost between home and host. I'm doing it on a gross basis, so it's greater than one. One is costless trade. And for multinationals, it's important to think of these very broadly. It's not just tariffs or transport costs. It's also the need for face-to-face contact and quick delivery. I suppose McDonald's restaurants could produce all their hamburgers in one factory and wherever it's located, St. Louis in the United States, and ship them abroad, but you can see, even if it's quick transport, it's probably not a good business model to try to do something like that. Think of tea as very broadly. Then there's marginal costs of production in a two-country model, and also their market sizes, which I've denoted S on the slide. And these things, I've subscripted them because those things in particular can depend on the countries in question, the cost depending particularly on factor prices. So there is a hexaroline level or under model where countries have different factor endowments translating into different factor prices, say for skilled versus unskilled labor. And so in these models, you can get horizontal multinationals as an equilibrium structure. And that typically occurs when firm level fixed costs and these trade costs are large relative to plant level fixed costs. So firm level scale economies, big relative to plant level scale economies. And I've just put down one equation from one of Tony Venable's in my papers, where absolutely identical countries, the factor prices are going to be equalized, and you have a relationship shown in this equation, where if the left-hand side is large, both sides of the equation go from between 1/2 and 1, and so where trade costs balance with F and G creates a decision whether to open a foreign factory or a domestic one. When countries are not similar, then things get a lot more complicated, and it's very hard to get analytical solutions to models. A lot of this is done by simulation. I do it by writing nonlinear complementarity problems and solving those for the equilibrium, where some things are slack and some things are active in equilibrium. National firms or vertical multinationals just reverses the inequality. And also those are more likely to occur when the countries are asymmetric. So if wages are asymmetric in the countries, you might want just a single plant in the low wage country, even if other factors suggest being a horizontal firm. And also market sizes then become important. If you have two countries, but they're very different sizes, you don't want to incur the fixed cost to put a plant in the really small market. It just doesn't pay. Okay. So we're not going to make a lot of ranges of goods and services on small Pacific islands, for example. So that's kind of the flavor. It looks simple, but when you endogenize factor prices, it gets complicated quickly, and analytical solutions are elusive. And so I do a lot of this by simulation. So I'm going to now show you some data and just preview some of the results that I'm going to show you in the data. First is that when we find this again and again, whatever the politicians or journalists think of multinationals do, it appears over and over again in the US data and also for other countries like Germany, that the horizontal motives are in fact the dominant one. That's the dominant form. It's not this labor cost arbitrage idea of these vertical firms. Second, trade between parents and affiliates is surprisingly small relative to their affiliate total sales. Third country, this export platform phenomenon is not very puzzling after all. It's almost entirely regional trade where you have you have one plant that serves multiple countries, that are close together and in a free trade area. Provision of its services and intangibles is large. And I want to make sure I have some time to talk about this at the end, because this is a weakness in our empirical analysis. And these things are not just technology. We should keep using the word technology over and over again, but includes things on the list, if you could, the font's a little small, like management, marketing, finance, does include R&D and intellectual property, but things like brand value and goodwill, contracts, customer lists, train and assemble workforces, and specialized software. All of those things are what I mean by intangible assets and services. They are under research because they're poorly documented, because they're poorly measured. A lot of this is proprietary information of firms, and it's in accounting frameworks, they're simply called profits, the return to these things, as if they were monopoly rents or something. And in input-output tables, and I'll come back to this point, they're lumped in with all capital. Okay, so some data here, and I broke out India from the U.S. Aggregate statistics for all U.S. affiliates abroad in all industries. All sales is the top section. Share to the host is 58%. Share to third is fairly high, 29%. But the important thing about that line is the share that goes back to the U.S. is quite small, 13%. And again, I'm sort of emphasizing this multiple times. A lot of people have the vision of these multinationals. You hear phrases like exporting jobs. They're sending jobs abroad to exploit cheap labor, and they're shipping back that output. That's only about 13% of U.S. foreign affiliate sales goes back to the U.S. The numbers from India are even more concentrated in serving the Indian market, 67%. And I think that's just fairly easily explained just by the size of the country. Okay. They're producing in India to sell in India, and it's a very big country, and there's not rich markets around India for you to be exporting, doing export platform sales to third countries. The next level, break it down into goods and services. And here you see even bigger departure that in India, the US affiliates are very heavily concentrated on serving the local market. What goes back to the US is very small, 10%. Again, I think this is just largely intuitively and simply explained by the size of the economy. Services is where India looks different from the US averages. There is a significant, fairly large number for India's, the share of Indian service affiliate production that goes back to the United States, 34%. That's a pretty big number. A number of the papers I heard over the last couple, yesterday and this morning, make that, pretty reasonable. I mean, I sort of understand now a lot of what's going on. So that's quite a big number. And I'll have more to say about that in just a second. And then that last little box on the bottom is just to emphasize that what US foreign affiliates are doing worldwide and also in India is not just shipping, capital intensive, skill intensive components to factories to have them screwed together. The amount of US goods shipped to affiliates from the US is only about 7% of their sales worldwide. And for India, it's a tiny number, 3%. I mean, that's just not what's going on with these foreign affiliates. and multinationals. Okay, table 2 is, those were sort of within goods and services. This is goods versus services and where we are in this. For all US affiliates, you know, the message of this table, it depends what you want to measure. Okay, and they're really quite big differences. If you want to measure goods versus services by all sales, then for all US foreign affiliates, it's about 2 to 1. And so there's some justification for concentrating on manufacturing, I guess. For India, it's about 50-50. It's much more even than in the aggregate US data. But manufacturing uses an awful lot of purchased intermediate inputs. So if instead of looking at total sales, we look at value added, which is the second set of numbers, US total US foreign affiliate activity is kind of reversed a little bit. It's close to 50-50, but there's a dramatic difference in the numbers for India. Value added is much more concentrated in services than it is in goods relative to all US foreign affiliates. If instead of value added, you want to look at employment, the numbers get even a little bit more skewed. That for all US affiliates, the numbers are reversed from the sales number. That employment is much higher in service sector affiliates than it is for goods affiliates. And in India, again, quite a dramatic difference. So US affiliates in India, 83% of employees are in service sector. So it's really a big number. And other things I've heard in the last 2 days, I think that's completely plausible. The next table I'm going to kind of skip over because I want to make sure I get to some other newer things. The message in this table is partly that for US affiliates, and I think for other countries' multinationals, FDI in foreign production is basically a rich world phenomenon. And that's one thing we find very different in the micro approach that I alluded to at the beginning of the talk from the older macro international finance approach. The old macro approach basically says, well, capital flows from rich countries to poor countries, from capital abundant countries to capital poor countries. And that is absolutely not what the case is for multinational firms. It's very different from how portfolio investment might move. It is basically a rich world phenomenon. So I'm just going to kind of skip the numbers. The lower part emphasizes that in spite of all the stuff we've heard about globalization and supply chains, global value chains, the shares, what US affiliates do abroad hasn't changed for 35 years. Okay, it remains highly concentrated in serving local and regional markets. The numbers are not very much different from what they were 35 years ago. And the share for third countries has gone up a little bit, but that basically entirely, it turns out, with the Irish affiliates have a plant, a pharmaceutical plant, serves the whole EU. Okay. What? I don't know. We started late. I don't know what you want me to do because I am at a decision point here whether to skip a couple things. Okay, then I'm going to skip talking about vertical integration versus outsourcing, which is a really interesting topic, but there's other things I prefer to get onto. So, two main approaches, and unfortunately, I think I'll cut that off. Okay, so what I do want to talk about, and I think is really underemphasized, including in the business press, is this notion of these intangible assets and knowledge capital. I think they're extremely important empirically and theoretically. This non-rival property is vital in theoretical models to support horizontal firms in equilibrium, but they're difficult to identify and measure. As I said, they're often labeled as simply profits, and they're lumped in with all capital in input-output tables. They can be addressed indirectly through residual values, and I'm going to give you some examples of that. So just to motivate this, I put in this table, which gives sales, value-added profits, and net income. Net income is an accountant's definition. Profits are much more what an economist would mean by profits for U.S. foreign affiliates abroad. And the thing that people have noticed and has caused a lot of controversy or negative views of multinationals from both the right and left of political spectrum in the US are the very right-hand numbers where you see profits as a share of value added is 36%. Looks like very, very profitable number. And net income, which includes things like return on equity and capital gains, is actually more than 100% of value added. So these numbers have attracted a kind of a lot of attention, and again, grumbling that multinationals are moving jobs abroad and avoiding taxes and all kinds of things. Now, the problem with that is that there's just been virtually no attempt to measure these intangible assets. So I'll give you an example here. And business school people, professors love to talk about the Apple iPhone and break it down to show the different sourcing internationally and so forth. So this is just one example of this breakdown. You get quite different ones in different places. But here shows the physical components and assembly. You get a factory gate price of $194. You add in distribution and miscellaneous costs. You get a total cost of $330, but the retail price is $600 for the phone. So Apple profit is $270 per phone. Okay. People love, you can see how this generates a lot of animosity. Maybe Apple deserves a lot of animosity, but maybe not for this reason, because you notice that in this list of things that make up this total cost, that there's all kinds of stuff missing. All right. So I kind of put those on the right-hand side there in that column. It's missing software. I mean, Apple's as much a software company as it is a hardware company. It's missing management, marketing, finance, R&D, and intellectual property, brand value and goodwill, et cetera. All of those things are missing because they're just not measured. And so profit is just a label that's stuck on something that's a residual value. Okay. So there are some attempts to measure these, and this is typically done by consulting companies or business school people. And so I just wanted to flash another sign about this. This is this company B2B is a consulting company that, among other things, calculates brand value. So, roughly brand value is what is the value of your company because it's called McDonald's hamburgers with golden arches instead of Joe's hamburgers across the street, which, you know, might actually make better hamburgers. Okay, what's the difference in the market value of the firm as a consequence of that? And these are numbers for 2020. They're pretty up to date. And you see that these brand values can run into many billions of US dollars. This particular year, Apple's at the top with a brand value of $323 billion US dollars. And you see it in a number of tech companies at the top. Then there's Coca-Cola, and then there's a number of automobile firms and so forth. Just a quick example of an intangible asset that is real, but difficult to measure and often just described as profits rather than actually returns on an asset that's been built up over many, many years of investments. Okay, so there's been two papers recent papers that attempt to look at this. This Chenmoth and Timmer paper is a very recent one. Whoops. Talk about this. In the world input-output table, there is a number for it goes by industry, by country. There is an item called capital. As near as I can figure out, it's just a residual value to make the rows and columns balance. Okay, it's just largely made up, right? But it's there and it's called capital. But having said that, so let's assume it is capital. What they do is take that number and compare it to an independently constructed measure of tangible capital, which basically I've outlined there what that includes. That includes property, plant, and equipment, transport equipment, information technology assets, communications assets, and other physical things. So they construct a measure of tangible capital, and then they compare that to the measure of total capital as reported in the world input-output table for that industry and country pair. And they come up with some pretty big numbers. This is what they come up with for sort of world manufacturing. They have a labor share of 51%, tangible capital share of 18%, and an intangible capital share of 30.7%. In other words, the intangible component of capital is very large. It's 1.7 times the value of the tangible capital share. And they are able to trace this over a 15-year period. And labor share has gone down. This actually is, I think, fairly well known, particularly for the US. Labor share has been falling. The capital share has been rising, but it's been rising more in these intangible assets. The nature of production processes in both manufacturing and services have made these intangible assets much more important than the physical ones. The bottom part does this by stages of production. And what they find there is that the big increase in the share of intangible capital is due to the upstream production stages, as opposed to final production or distribution. So upstream stages are all these corporate level functions like management, marketing, finance, as well as the knowledge assets of embodied in R&D and patents and so forth. So these the attempt to manage this is really been quite valuable. Okay, a second return on this is another paper, and this looks at large US firms, not exclusively multinationals. And it talks about, again, starts with this very high reported figures of return on invested capital for that have been, widely discussed as, often in negative terms. And they maintain, and I totally agree with this, it's largely due to the mismeasurement of intangible capital in the denominator of this ratio. This ratio is basically profit divided by capital, but if you undermeasure capital, sixth grade algebra, it's, if you make the denominator small, it makes the ratio quite large. And so what they do is try to correct measures of these return on invested capital by measuring intangible capital, and they divide it into two sources. I'll try to be very brief here: knowledge capital and organizational capital. They add that to the denominator of the return on invested capital measure. And sorry, I got behind on my clicks. This is what they find. Briefly, I'll just look at the right-hand column. So for the most profitable US firms, they turn out to be the ones that have a lot of intangible assets in the way they measure it. And for the most, the 90th percentile of firm profitability, incorporating intangible capital lowers the measured rate of return by 28.8%, very large number. And then they divide it by different kinds of industries. So RMAN industries stands for routine manual labor. So industries that are low in routine manual labor, so they're skilled labor intensive or capital intensive. This correction for intangible assets lowers these really high rates of return, measured rates of return, by a full 50%. Okay, it's very, very big difference. ICAP industries are ones that have a large amount of intangible capital. And for them, for the most successful firms, incorporating that measure of intangible capital lowers the measured rate of return by 40.5%. So there's quite a big difference. And we're finally getting some handle on the fact of how important these things are. And, I've maintained for a number of decades that these are really important in multinational firms, but we simply don't have a handle on it. It's often ignored because it's just proprietary knowledge of firms, and it's very, very difficult to measure these things. You can't do that. I'm going to skip over some other things. I think these slides can be made available, and I was making up a bibliography and kind of ran out of time. I can try to make that available. There appears horizontal motives tend to dominate these replication motives for US firms. A recent study by German firms, they expected to find that was much less true for German firms. It turns out it's about exactly the same. Sales to local and regional markets dominate this idea that you produce abroad cheaply to ship home. Third country sales are not a mystery. They're all to close by regional markets with low trade barriers. Service sectors are far more important in foreign affiliate activity than often people realize. Affiliates are profitable, but this seems to be due to mismeasurement. I'm not saying they're not profitable, but things get very distorted. Okay, this is my last slide, and so it gives you some ideas where I think things, a lot of work could be done. Data and empirics need to integrate trade with foreign affiliate production. Right now, they're quite separate. There's a huge amount of foreign affiliate production and cross-hauling between high-income countries. And so, for example, gravity equations that ignore foreign affiliate production are way underestimating the volume of economic activity that's going on among the high-income countries. Because a lot of it is not shipping cars across the Atlantic Ocean, it's producing your cars in the country where you're going to sell them. Secondly, measuring vertical integration versus outsourcing is hard because while we observe the vertical integration, integrated production, what exactly is outsourcing versus using spot markets or however you want to define that? And also, trade theorists have not really told us why we should care about this question, to be blunt. Greater effort to measure and document intangible assets, I think is very important in understanding really what multinationals do. And that's important for understanding things like spillovers. A lot of it's coming from the existence of these knowledge assets that are being transferred to foreign affiliates or to contractors and licensees. Recognize the importance of service sectors and build better data. I think India is way ahead on that. I think a lot of stuff I heard yesterday and today, doing a good job on that. Understand competition for capturing export platform production. I'm not sure that's really much of an issue for India, surrounded by the close by countries are not big markets in terms of demand. There's a lot of results I haven't gone through, a lot of work on intellectual property protection, contract enforcement, spillovers through worker mobility or transferring technology and improving the management of local supplier firms. There's a lot of work that it can be a good guide to public policy. Examine the tensions in public policy between attracting foreign affiliate production, attracting multinationals in, yet encouraging spillovers. I mean, if you put too many burdens on multinationals, they're not going to come at all. China's been successful in this by, it's such a big market, they've just bludgeoned firms they beat them into transferring their technology. And there's now increasing resistance in the US and in Europe, both, particularly in Europe, to giving in to this kind of extortion. And so we'll see where that goes. So that's it. It's kind of brief, but I think we've made a lot of progress in moving the discussion of multinationals from simply a capital market macro perspective into a microeconomic and trade perspective.
Which time we have? Okay, so we have about 10 minutes of question.
Sure.
Okay. Any question? What is that?
First, I was trying to understand the human part. First of all, what is intangible capital that I was trying to think what you said, proprietary issues or is it costly? I mean, it comes from missing values, unaccounted for values. That is intangible that we secondly that's
Yeah, so I mean, these things are built up over time, in my view, much like physical capital accumulated. So over time, firms develop proprietary technologies. They develop management systems. Brand value is built up over time. It's another thing for reputation capital. These things are intangible, but they're very real. It's just the difficulty measuring it. You can't measure something, the tendency is to say it doesn't exist. But I think that in the case of multinationals, that's a really things are very real and have value. And they're key to understanding this expansion motives of multinationals. This isn't just an accounting question.
I think I can understand, but how is the root of dollar value? How is the dollar arrive at a dollar value? Because you're getting it from capital minus that tangible part. So there is some dollar value. So what is that dollar value? Where is it dollar?
Well, as measured, it's often measured as individuals, which isn't very satisfactory. So it's not the smoking gun idea, you know, these values are, you know, as I said in those last two papers, kind of taken by constructing capital values for things that are measurable, and then subtracting them from evaluate compared to the total market value of the firm. So a lot of these tech firms, the market, so this is Tobin's Q, right? Those of you who remember do macro still teach Tobin's Q? I don't know. Okay. So Tobin's Q is basically, correct me if I'm wrong, the sort of market value of the firm divided by the value of capital. But the thing in the denominator, that's the paper I was talking about, tends to be measured physical capital, you know, carried forward. You know, perpetual inventory methods plus depreciation give you a value of tangible capital, which is basically physical things in detail. And so for a lot of tech firms, pharmaceutical firms and so forth, the Tobin's Q is way, way up, you know, could be 25. Market value of the firm could be 25 times the value of its tangible capital. So that, you know, isn't monopoly profits. It's attributable to these things that are difficult and elusive to measure. I'm not sure I'm giving a good answer, but just because you can't measure it doesn't mean it's not real.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Markusen, for your very interesting talk. While listening to your discussion on why we should emphasize firm level decision making and understanding motives for multinational corporation production, my sort of the question that came to mind was: is it possible for us to use these very disaggregated data sets that are now being released by customs authorities that actually show firm to firm transactions? And whether we can locate this sort of intangible capital within those firm-to-firm relationships. Since you mentioned the sort of lack of data and difficulty in quantifying what these intangibles are, I was wondering if that's one potential empirical strategy we could adopt in terms of like looking at these firm-to-firm relationships and seeing whether those relationships themselves embody that kind of relatively emotional, intangible capital.
Yeah, I'm kind of pessimistic. So there's some things that are you can see in data sets like affiliate royalty payments for technology use of patents and copyrights and so forth. And So like in the Bureau of Economic Analysis, US data, that those numbers are reported. And they're surprisingly very small. I think companies just don't put a lot of effort into documenting these things themselves. I have a friend who's an electrical engineer for Seagate, which makes disk drives. And he spends a lot of the time on phone and Zoom, solving technical problems and making adjustments from Boulder, Colorado, where I live, to the factory in Malaysia. And that kind of flow of services is not showing up in R&D and royalties for patents and trademarks. It's an engineering service that just doesn't appear in any very measurable source. So I think for a long time, people are going to be stuck with this notion of calculating these things as residuals. Because it's, it is, I want to emphasize again, it's way broader than just the use of patents and trademarks. It's management, marketing, finance, brand value, all of these things. I don't even know if firms themselves document these things very carefully in their internal accounting. They probably should, but I don't think they're required to by law. And so I don't know. I'm not that optimistic. I'm retired. I'm throwing this challenge.
Can I
This is your topic for.
take this forward?
Sure.
Enjoying what you said. Is it true that this is partly because in the field of area of multinational, you are trying to measure something for which we know from micro theory or marketing, and there is technology.
Yeah.
And since you don't have a market technology, how do I get more? So the residual is the only way, and there is no way anyone can get a market. If I could create technology, I would need multinationals. And we need multinational precisely because there is no market for technology. Difficult to, I think intangibles take up a lot of this slack in the markets.
Did I just lose my? Right. So another example would be spillovers. People have gotten creative in trying to measure some of these things, backward and forward linkages. But for example, spillovers through worker mobility. One way to measure that is if you have sort of matched employer-employee data sets, what they try to do is say, okay, if a worker moves from a multinational firm to a domestic firm, what are their wages compared to the other employees in the firm that have the same resumes in terms of education, years of experience, and so forth. They do document that those spillovers through worker mobility are pretty substantial. That's a case where you do observe. You can, if you have that employer-employee data, you can observe those wages and the characteristics of the worker. I did a little work with two Danish guys where it's called foreign firms domestic wages, and we were able, it's a small country. There's a wonderful matched employer-employee data. People ask me what the sample was, and I say Denmark. 100% sample of the entire economy. So that's sort of an example of a creative way where there is some hard data there that you can measure, which is the wages of employees that have moved and those that stay with.
So there are some cases you find that the wages of people with tiers are lower than the other side. So they pay for the learning and then get the higher wage.
Well, I think often it goes the other way, that the multinationals pay higher wages, and that in turn creates something you have to be careful about, which is just selection bias, that the multinational in the first place are hiring, cherry picking off the best workers. So It's a complicated thing, but it's a great topic. And I hope we have some better work on that.
I think we should close now. Okay, we organize our, maybe it's time for us to resolve.
Yeah.
Finish.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you all, and I'm sure at lunch, those who have any questions, you can take it. Okay. The fascinating topic, a very new to me, area of trade theory, psychology theory. Let's hope cite something to support. Thank you very much.
Sir, I request you to give the token of appreciation to those.
How can you not give a token alive? There are actually two tokens.
Oh. Okay, thank you very much.
Now I request Professor Bhattacharya, head of Kolkata economics discipline, to give a token of appreciation, Professor.
These are the wages of chairing without doing anything.
Thank you all for your participation. Now we have a policy code.
Yeah. Please, requesting everyone, because we are going to start here.